Welcome back to the deep dive. We have a stack of research on the table today that I think is going to fundamentally change the way you look at a map of South Africa.
It really might.
We usually talk about history in very, binary terms, right? Black and white, colonizer and colonized. But today we're looking at a group of people who existed in the gray area.
Or maybe they created their own area entirely.
That's a better way to put it.
It's a story that really challenges that whole Rainbow Nation concept because, well, it suggests there was a Rainbow Nation happening about 2 centuries before Nelson Mandela ever used the phrase.
Exactly. We are talking about the Griqua people. And just looking at these sources, it is a paradox from start to finish. I mean, you have a group that considers itself South Africa's first multiracial nation, yet if you look at standard history books,
Or a footnote.
they're a footnote, or they're just lumped into the colored category without any real distinction. But the reality is, and the sources are clear on this, these were state builders. I mean, they had constitutions, they had standing armies, they were trekking across the interior of southern Africa long before the famous Voortrekkers were even, packing their wagons.
And that is the part that I think surprises people the most. We all have this image of the Great Trek, the white Boers moving away from British rule on the Cape as the defining pioneer moment of the 19th century.
Right, it's the big one.
But the Griqua were already doing it. They were doing it first. They were
Yep.
the pioneers of the interior. They were the ones mapping the routes, finding the water sources, and establishing the towns that later settlers would eventually occupy.
Okay, so here's the mission for this deep dive. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I mean that literally. We're going from the Cape Colony up through the rugged, arid interior of the Northern Cape, then over the Drakensberg Mountains, which is no joke, and even up into Namibia.
It's an epic journey.
It really is. And along the way, we need to unpack the origins of this distinct ethnicity. How do you get a group forming from Dutch colonists, Khoisan, slaves, and other indigenous groups that doesn't just dissolve into the population, but forms a hard political identity?
That is the absolute key question. And as part of that, we have to deal with some very heavy, very loaded terminology. I'm looking at words in these historical records like bastard and Afrikaner, and I think you're going to be shocked at how the meanings of those words have completely flipped 180 degrees.
That part about the word Afrikaner, honestly, it stopped me in my tracks when I was reading the prep. I had to read it 3 times, but we'll get there. Let's start at the very beginning. We're in the 17th and 18th centuries in the Cape Colony. This is the soup, so to speak. What are the ingredients that created the Griqua people?
Well, it's a very specific set of circumstances. You have the Dutch East India Company establishing its refreshment station at the Cape. And it is a very male-dominated society.
Not a lot of European women around.
Very few, especially in the early decades of the colony. So naturally, relationships formed across the color line. The primary patriarchs, the fathers of this new group, were European men, mostly Dutch, but also some German, some French Huguenot.
And the matriarchs, the mothers.
The matriarchs were primarily Khoisan women, the indigenous pastoralists who were already living in the Cape, and also women who were enslaved, who were brought in from places like Indonesia, Madagascar, or East Africa.
So initially you just have these children of mixed descent. Now, in a lot of colonial societies, these children would just be absorbed into the lowest rungs of society, right? But something different seems to have happened here. The sources say they didn't just assimilate.
That's the crucial pivot point. If they had just married back into the white settler population, they would have eventually been absorbed, over generations. If they had married back into the traditional Khoi tribes, they might have lost that European cultural connection.
So what did they do?
They started marrying each other. They formed an endogamous group. By marrying among themselves, they created a community that was distinct. It was a conscious choice.
So they were sort of caught in the middle.
Exactly. They were too European for the tribes. I mean, they spoke Dutch, they were Christians, they wore European clothes, but they were too non-white for the colonial administration to ever treat them as equals. So they created their own space.
And modern science actually backs this all up, doesn't it? I saw a note here about some 21st century genetic studies.
Yes, the genetic data is fascinating because it confirms the oral history, but it also adds all this new nuance. It shows a clear mix of European, Khoisan, and slave ancestry, which you'd expect, but it also shows lineages from Tuana, San, and even Xhosa groups.
So it wasn't just a one-time mix.
No, it wasn't just a Cape phenomenon. As they moved, as they trekked, they absorbed other people. It was a true melting pot in a way that very few other groups were at the time.
Okay, so we have to talk about the name. The sources are very clear that for a long, long time, This group referred to themselves as bastards or basters. Now, in modern English, that is a slur. If you call someone that today, you are absolutely looking for a fight.
Absolutely.
But the note suggests it had a different vibe back in the 18th century.
You really have to strip away the modern English pejorative. The word comes from the Dutch bastard, which essentially just meant hybrid or mixed. In the context of the 18th century frontier, it wasn't necessarily an insult about the legitimacy of your birth. It was a classification.
The classification.
Yes. And for the people who use it for themselves, it actually became a badge of honor.
How on earth does that become a badge of honor?
Well, think about the hierarchy at the time. You had the civilized colony, and then you had the savage interior, as they saw it. By calling themselves bastards, they were signaling, we are not savages, we are Christians. We speak Dutch, we live in houses, we ride horses, we shoot guns.
So it was a way of distinguishing themselves.
Exactly. A way of distinguishing themselves from the tribal Khoisan, or from the enslaved population. It was a claim to status, to a higher rung on the social ladder.
So it's almost like saying, we belong to the class of people who are part of the colonial economy who have these valuable skills.
Precisely. They were highly skilled. They were the craftsmen, the transport riders, the people who could fix a wagon wheel in the middle of nowhere. If you were a baster, it meant you had skills that were incredibly valuable to the colony.
But then we get to the other term, Afrikaner. And this is the big one. The source material here notes that for over 350 years, the word Afrikaner was used to describe mixed-race people.
This is a massive, massive historical reclamation. If you look at the records from the 1700s and the early 1800s, when people wrote about Afrikaners, they were almost exclusively talking about these mixed-race groups, the Orlam, the Griqua.
Not white people.
Not white people. They were the Africans of European culture and descent. The white settlers at the time referred to themselves as Dutch or Burgher or Christians. They did not call themselves Afrikaners.
So when did that change? Because today, of course, Afrikaner is completely synonymous with white South Africans of Dutch descent.
It's a surprisingly recent shift. It didn't really happen until around 1876. There was a political and cultural movement by a group of Boer intellectuals, specifically a group called the Genootschap van Regte Afrikaners, which means the Fellowship of Real Afrikaners.
The Fellowship of Real Afrikaners.
Right. And they wanted to build a white national identity, specifically to counter the growing British influence in the region. They needed a name, a label that tied them to the soil, to the continent of Africa.
So they just took the name, they appropriated it.
Effectively, yes. They took the term Afrikaner, which had been used by the Griqua and other mixed race groups for centuries, and they completely redefined it to mean white Dutch speaker. They racialized it.
That is ironic on so many levels. I mean, it means the Griqua are the original Afrikaners, at least in terms of the terminology.
It completely flips the script. If you restore that original definition, the whole history of Afrikaner nationalism starts to look very, very different. It implies that the cultural roots of that identity, the language, the frontier lifestyle, were actually pioneered by people of color.
Okay, let's go back to the bastard name for a second. Even though they seemed to have been proud of it, eventually it became a PR problem, didn't it?
It did. And for that, you can thank the missionaries, specifically the London Missionary Society, the LMS. They arrived in the early 1800s with the goal of converting and civilizing the people on the frontier. And they found it incredibly awkward to have a congregation that was proudly calling themselves the Bastards.
I can just imagine the letters back to London. Dear Board of Directors, the Bastard congregation is doing exceptionally well this month.
Exactly. It just didn't fly in polite Victorian society. It sounded terrible in English. So in 1813, a missionary named Reverend John Campbell sat down with the leaders and basically said, look, we need a rebrand.
And he's the one who suggested Griqua. Was he just making that up? Did he pull it out of a hat?
No, and this is really important. He didn't just impose some European name on them. He actually looked at their history, their lineage. He knew that many of them, a core group, descended from a specific Khoisan group called the Griqua, or sometimes Griqua, who used to live near the Cape.
Right. The sources mention that the first big leader, Adam Coke I, had married into that specific line.
Yes, Adam Coke's wife was the daughter of a Griqua chief. So by adopting the name Griqua, they were doing two brilliant things at once. First, they were satisfying the missionaries by dropping the bastard label.
Okay.
But second, and more importantly, they were proudly reclaiming their indigenous African heritage. They were saying, we are of this land. We have roots here. We are the Griqua.
And that brings us right to Adam Coke. This name, Cook, it means cook. right, in Dutch.
Yes, it's Dutch for cook or chef.
So we have the founder of an entire nation, a dynasty, who is named after his job when he was a slave.
That's his origin story, and it's an incredible one. Adam Koch, I was born a slave. He worked as a cook. But he was clearly an extraordinary individual. He didn't just escape. He navigated the system. He actually bought his own freedom.
Which must have been incredibly difficult.
Incredibly. And not just that. He went on to acquire burger rights, citizenship rights that were usually reserved for whites. And he even bought his own farm near Pekeberg.
So he made it. By the standards of the time, he had the farm, the rights, the freedom. So why did he leave? Why trek into the unknown?
Because in a colonial society, rights for a person of color are always precarious. As the white settler population expanded and the racial laws started to harden, he saw the writing on the wall. He was facing constant discrimination, social pressure, and land encroachment.
He knew it wouldn't last.
He realized that to be truly free, he couldn't just be a free black inside a white-run colony. He had to go where the colony wasn't. He had to have his own society.
So he packs up. And this isn't just a single family moving. He gathers a significant following.
He becomes a magnet for people. Other freed slaves, other bastards, Khoi people who were losing their land to the settlers, they all rallied around him, and he leads them north, beyond the official borders of the Cape Colony, up towards the Orange River.
And this is where the state-building part really kicks in. The critique we saw earlier mentioned that we often gloss over this. We might say, oh, they had a government, and then just move on. But looking at these notes, this was sophisticated stuff. This wasn't just a chief sitting under a tree making decisions.
No, not at all. This was a constitutional republic in the making. They drafted a written constitution. Just think about how radical that is for a group of semi-nomadic frontiersmen in the early 1800s in southern Africa.
It's incredible. So how did it work? Who was in charge?
The leader held the title of captains, which is Dutch for captain. But he wasn't a dictator or an absolute monarch. His power was checked by the Rod, or the council.
And the Rod was, it's like a parliament.
Sort of. It was a body of nominated counselors who would debate policy, judicial matters, decisions about war and peace. The Captain had a veto, yes, but he couldn't just rule by decree. He had to work with the Rod to get their consensus.
It really sounds like they were mirroring the Dutch systems they had seen, but adapting them for their own use on the frontier.
Precisely. They had magistrates to hear court cases. They had a police force of sorts. They used titles they were familiar with, like Veldkornet for their local officers. If you committed a crime in Griqualand, you didn't just get beaten up. You went before a magistrate, and your case was heard according to their written law.
They were projecting an image, weren't they?
Absolutely. They were projecting the image of a civilized Christian state to the outside world, especially to the British, to show that they were worthy of respect and, crucially, worthy of treaties.
And the capital of this state was Griquatown, which was originally called Clearwater.
Right. Clearwater means clear water. It was renamed Griquatown after that big meeting in 1813. And it became a real hub. It wasn't just a few tents. They built stone houses, a church, schools for their children. For a long time, it was the most significant town north of the Orange River.
So if you were a traveler, an explorer, or a missionary going into the interior,
Griquatown was your last stop. It was your last chance for supplies, for news, for a bit of civilization before you plunged into the unknown.
Okay, let's talk about the military aspect, because you can't build a state in this kind of environment on a volatile frontier without being able to defend it. The sources talk a lot about the commando system. How did the Griqua become such fearsome fighters?
It's another one of those ironies. Their skills were given to them by their oppressors. It goes all the way back to their time in the Cape Colony. The Dutch East India Company was constantly at war with the San, or Bushmen, and the Xhosa on the eastern frontier.
And they didn't have enough soldiers?
Not nearly enough. So they conscripted the so-called baster men into their commando units.
So they taught them everything they knew. They handed them guns and trained them.
They gave them guns, they put them on horses, and they taught them commando warfare, which is basically a highly mobile guerrilla style of fighting. You ride fast, you shoot accurately from the saddle, you disengage, you flank. The Griqua became absolute masters of this.
Better than the Boers?
Many contemporary accounts say they were better shots and better riders than the Boers. This was their specialty.
And this leads to this concept of the orlum. We need to define this because the term pops up a lot in the sources.
Orlum is a fascinating and slightly slippery term. It generally refers to people who were acculturated to the colony. They spoke Dutch, they were Christian, they used European technology, but they had moved out of the colony to live independently.
So the Griqua are an orlum group.
Yes. In this context, it often refers to these highly mobile groups of armed, mounted, Dutch-speaking marksmen who left the Cape to live a free and often predatory lifestyle in the interior. They were the trek Boers before the actual Boer Great Trek.
You said predatory.
We have to be honest about the history. They weren't just peaceful farmers looking for a new home. They were heavily armed men entering territories that were already occupied by other groups like the San, the Tswana, the Korana. They needed cattle, they needed resources, they needed grazing land.
So there was conflict.
A lot of conflict. Sometimes they traded, but very often they raided.
This brings us to a specific event that I really want to zoom in on, the tragedy of Moordkap. The notes here paint a really cinematic and just horrific picture. This was a clash between a Griqua commando and the Ndebele, right?
Yes, and this is a story of hubris, of overconfidence. You have a Griqua commando, several hundred strong, led by a man named Gert Hoijman, and they decide to launch a major raid into the territory of the Ndebele people.
And the Ndebele at this time were led by King Zilikazi.
Now, Zilikazi, one of the most formidable military strategists in all of Southern African history. He was a former general of Shaka Zulu. You do not mess with Zilikazi lightly.
But the Griqua had a massive technological advantage. They had guns and horses. The Ndebele warriors had spears and shields.
Exactly, and that technological superiority made them arrogant. They rode in, they managed to raid a massive number of cattle, thousands of them, and they started driving them back toward Griqua territory.
So far, so good for them.
So far, so good. But Hoijman, the leader, he was nervous. He knew Mzilikazi. He told his men, "We need to keep moving. Don't stop. Mzilikazi will send a regiment after us. They will follow us."
But the men didn't listen.
They were victorious. They were tired. And they were hungry. They're looking at all this cattle they've just captured. They decided to stop at a hill near the Vaal River to feast. They slaughtered some of the captured oxen. They started the fires. And they had a massive barbecue.
A celebration.
A huge celebration. Yeah. And afterwards, they fell asleep with full bellies, completely confident that their guns made them invincible.
And Zilikazi's men were watching the whole time.
Zilikazi's impi had been tracking them silently. They attacked at dawn, or just before, in complete silence. They used the classic Zulu horns of the buffalo formation to completely encircle the hill.
The Griqua were caught sleeping.
Completely. Their guns were useless in the dark and the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. It was an absolute massacre. The sources say around 1,000 Griqua men were killed.
1,000 men. That's a generation of fathers and sons wiped out in a single night.
It was utterly devastating for the Griqua nation. The hill was named Moordkap, which means murder hill. But there's a twist to this story that I find fascinating. It wasn't just a massacre. It was also a moment of unexpected cultural transfer.
How so? What do you mean?
Well, the Ndebele captured some of the survivors, mostly women and children who had been with the wagon train that was following the commando. And this included the granddaughter of another famous Griqua leader, Barend Barends. Her name was Trudy.
And what happened to them?
These captives were integrated into the Ndebele nation. They were absorbed.
So they became Ndebele?
Yes, but they brought their oral knowledge with them. The sources note that these Griqua captives were the ones who introduced brick-building technology to the Ndebele. They taught them how to repair wagons, how to repair guns, and they even introduced elements of Christianity.
Wait, so you're saying that years, maybe decades, before the first European missionaries arrived to bring civilization to the Ndebele are already learning these skills from the Griqua people they captured in battle?
That is exactly what the sources suggest. It completely challenges that simple timeline of colonial influence. The Griqua were the intermediaries. They were the vectors of technology and ideas moving into the interior, even when they were on the losing side of a battle.
That is just wild. Let's look at the map again. Segment 4 in our outline talks about the Great Migrations, and it really emphasizes that these guys were constantly moving. It wasn't just one trek and they were done.
No, it's a state of perpetual motion, and it was almost always caused by dispossession. The pattern was tragic, and it repeated itself over and over.
What was the pattern?
The Griqua would move to a frontier area. They would settle it, build a town, maybe a church, and establish law and order. Then white trek Boers would start to arrive, attracted by the stability.
And then the government would follow.
The colonial government would eventually extend its borders to include the area. And the Griqua would be told, you don't really own this land because you aren't white, or your land titles aren't valid under our law, and they would be pushed further and further north.
So they go up to the Orange River, then some of them go all the way to Natal on the East Coast, and then they have to turn back.
It's this epic zigzag across the country. They went into Natal, hoping to settle there. It was good land. But then the British annexed Natal. And the Griqua leadership realized, we can't stay here. We'll be under the British thumb again. So they turned around and trekked back over the Drakensberg Mountains.
Let's talk about Griqualand West. This is the area around modern-day Kimberley. And this story is basically a legal thriller that ends with the discovery of diamonds.
It is the ultimate story of a resource curse. The Griqua in this western area were led by captains like Nicholas Waterbour and Andries Waterbour. For decades, nobody cared about their land. It was dry, it was scrubby, it was semi-desert.
So the British were happy to leave them alone.
More than that, the British were happy to sign treaties, recognizing Waterbour as the sovereign leader of a treaty state. They essentially said, you keep the peace up there on our northern border, and we formally recognize that it's your land.
And then 1866 happens.
A child finds a shiny pebble on a farm. It turns out to be a diamond. Then another is found, and suddenly, this dry, worthless scrubland is the most valuable patch of dirt on the entire planet.
And what happened to those treaties?
Effectively, they were shredded. You suddenly had three players all claiming the land. The Griqua, who legally owned it according to the treaties, the Boer republics of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, who suddenly decided, actually, this has always been our land.
And the British.
And the British, who decided that they needed to stabilize the region, which was a convenient way of saying they were taking the diamonds.
I'm reading here about the Transvaal president at the time, Pretorius. He just declared the diamond fields were Boer property by proclamation.
Yes, in 1870.
Right.
She just issued a proclamation and sent in some officials. But the British weren't going to let the Boers have it. So the British moved in and annexed the entire territory in 1871.
And the Griqua, the actual owners.
They were the ultimate losers. They lost their sovereignty. They lost the mineral wealth. Nicholas Waterbour was eventually jailed in 1876 for trying to support a rebellion of his own people against this very dispossession. It completely broke the back of the Griqua nation in the West.
So if you lose the West, you go east. This leads to the most famous trek of all, the trek to what became Griqualand East.
This was an incredible feat of human endurance, led by Adam Koch III. In 1861, he realized they were being squeezed out of their lands in the Free State area, and he made a momentous decision. He would lead his entire people to a so-called no-man's land that the British had offered them.
Where was this land?
It was a piece of territory wedged between Pondoland and the colony of Natal. But to get there, they had to cross the Drakensberg Mountains.
I've hiked in the Drakensberg. It is spectacular, but it is brutal terrain. We're talking about 3,000-meter peaks, sheer cliffs. It's not wagon country.
And imagine doing it with ox wagons. They had 2,000 people, something like 20,000 sheep and other livestock, and 300 wagons. In some places, they had to completely disassemble the wagons to lower them down precipices with ropes. They blasted rocks out of the way. It took them 2 years to complete this migration.
It's comparable to Hannibal crossing the Alps.
But with families and livestock and all their worldly possessions, it's an epic of survival.
And they established Kokstad on the other side.
Named after Adam Koch, yes. And here, in this new land, Koch tried one last desperate innovation to try and save his people's territory. He introduced the concept of private land titles.
Why was that considered so innovative at the time?
Well, traditionally, African land tenure was communal. The chief or king held the land in trust for the entire tribe. But Koch had seen how the British and Boers operated with their legal systems. He thought, if my people have a piece of paper, a title deed, that says this farm belongs to me under British-style law, maybe the white settlers won't be able to just take it.
A logical idea. Did it work?
Tragically, no. It completely backfired. Because once you have a title deed, it means you can sell the land. And the Griqua people were impoverished. They had lost most of their cattle during that brutal trek over the mountains.
So they were vulnerable?
Extremely. White settlers arrived with cash, with liquor, with goods, and they bought up the farms, often for a pittance. Within a single decade, most of the prime land in Griqualand East was owned by white farmers.
That is just heartbreaking. It feels like they tried to play by the colonizers' rules, and the rules were just used against them again.
It's a real tragedy of good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
Adam Koch tried to modernize his state to save it, but the economic pressures were just too great.
Let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about war and politics and land. Let's talk about culture and economy. How did they survive day to day? They weren't just soldiers.
No, not at all. For much of their history, they were the great middlemen of South Africa. They were the intermediaries who facilitated trade between the Cape Colony and the deep interior. They traded in ivory, cattle, ostrich feathers, and hides.
And they also had a unique export, according to the notes. Something called Griquatown gold.
I love this name. It sounds so romantic, but it's not actually gold.
What is it?
It's tiger's eye, that beautiful, shimmering golden brown gemstone that's found in abundance in the Northern Cape. The Griqua were the first to really commercialize it. They were mining it and trading Griquatown gold long before it became a staple in jewelry stores around the world.
And religion played a huge role in their culture, too. We mentioned the missionaries earlier, but the Griqua seem to have taken Christianity and really made it their own.
They absolutely did. They were devout Protestants, very much influenced by the Dutch Reformed Calvinist tradition. But they grew tired of being treated as second-class citizens in churches run by white missionaries.
Yeah.
They wanted their own space to worship.
So they founded their own church.
Yes, they established the Griqua Independent Church. And you can make a strong argument that this was the first truly indigenous, independent African church in South Africa, established decades before the more famous Ethiopian church movement began.
And that church is still around today.
It is. If you go to places like Kokstad or Campbell or even in parts of Namibia today, the Griqua Church is the absolute heartbeat of the community. It's not just a religious institution. It's the repository of their history, their culture, and their identity.
We also need to touch on language again. We said Afrikaner meant mixed race. It seems to follow that the language Afrikaans was largely developed and spoken by them too.
Absolutely. The simplified creolized Dutch that evolved into what we now call Afrikaans was the lingua franca of the mixed-race servant class in the Cape and of the Griqua and Orlam communities on the frontier, long before it was standardized by white academics.
So they were speaking it first.
They were speaking Afrikaans while the educated Boers were still trying to speak and write in a formal High Dutch. Many of the words, the idioms, the grammatical structure, it was all cooked up in the kitchens of the Cape and on the commandos of the colored and Griqua people.
So they're linguistic pioneers as well as geographic ones.
They are, in every sense.
Okay, let's move forward into the 20th century. The apartheid era. 1948 comes around. The National Party takes power with its ideology of strict racial segregation. Where do the Griqua fit into this new system?
They fit nowhere and yet everywhere. The apartheid government was obsessed with categorization. They had Bantu or black homelands. They had a white South Africa. And then in the middle, they had this catch-all category of colored.
And the Griqua were just lumped into colored.
Yes. And this was a profound form of erasure for them. Unlike, say, the Zulus or the Xhosas, who were given their own admittedly fake independent Bantu stands like KwaZulu or Transkei, the Griqua got nothing. There was no Griqua stand.
Their specific history was just ignored.
Their entire history of being a sovereign nation with captains and constitutions was completely ignored. They were just coloreds, period.
So what did that do to the people, to their identity?
It fractured them. To survive in that system, many people began to downplay or hide their Griqua heritage. If you could pass as Cape colored, maybe you got a slightly better job or could live in a slightly better area than if you insisted on being a tribal Griqua. It led to a terrible loss of identity for generations. People stopped telling the stories.
But that's changing now. Since the end of apartheid in 1994, there's been a renaissance, hasn't there?
A massive one. A huge resurgence of pride. People are coming out of the woodwork to reclaim the identity. The current population is estimated to be around 775,000, but it's incredibly hard to count because of that history of hiding and assimilation.
And is the new South African government recognizing them?
Slowly. It's a process. We now have the National Khoisan Council, which represents their interests. They are fighting for the same recognition as other traditional leaders, like the Zulu king, and there have been huge symbolic victories. Do you remember the story of Saartjie Baartman?
The Khoi woman who was taken to Europe in the early 19th century and exhibited.
Yes, she was displayed as a freak in London and Paris because of her steatopygia, her anatomy. She died there, and her remains were dissected and kept in a museum in Paris for over a century. It was grotesque.
A terrible story.
And the Griqua people were at the absolute forefront of the campaign in the 1990s to bring her remains home to South Africa for a proper burial.
It was about honoring the ancestors, wasn't it?
It was about restoring dignity to the Khoi mother as they saw her. When she was finally returned and buried in the Eastern Cape in 2002, it was a massive moment of healing and reclamation for the Griqua and all Khoi-descended people.
Before we wrap up, I just want to ask about the connection to Namibia. You mentioned Basters there. Are they the same people as the Griqua?
They're cousins, really.
Yeah.
The Rahubo Basters, who live in central Namibia, share the exact same origins, mixed descent from European men and Khoi women in the Cape. They also trekked north to escape colonial rule.
But they went a different way.
A different way, yes. They settled in a place called Rehoboth, south of Windhoek, They consider themselves a distinct ethnic group from the South African Griqua, but the history is almost perfectly parallel. They also had their own constitution, their own captain, and a fierce tradition of independence.
It's just amazing to see how these threads of history spread out across the entire subcontinent.
It really shows you that the frontier wasn't a simple line on a map. It was a zone of intense creation and conflict.
So we've covered centuries, we've crossed mountains, we've lost and regained names. If you had to summarize the so what of the Griqua story, what is it? Why does this matter?
I think the Griqua story destroys the simple narratives we like to tell ourselves about history. We like history to be clean. The British did this, the Boers did this, the Zulus did this. The Griqua show us that there was a fourth, a fifth, a sixth option. They represent a fusion that created something entirely new, something that was both indigenous and European, both African and Western at the same time.
They were the future South Africa, happening 200 years early.
That's a perfect way to put it. They were grappling with multiracialism, with hybrid identity, with how to combine Western law and African reality long before the modern state of South Africa even existed.
And for me, the takeaway is just the resilience. To build a state and lose it, to build another one and lose that, to trek over the highest mountains and lose that land too, but to still be here, to still have the church, the name, the pride. That is an unbelievable tenacity.
It truly is.
I want to leave our listener with that thought we touched on earlier, the rugby team. You might be watching a Currie Cup match and see the team from the Northern Cape, the Griquas, playing. And you might just think it's a cool historical name for a team.
Just a name.
But every time that team runs onto the field, they are carrying the name of a nation that trekked across deserts and over mountains time and time again just to find a place to call home.
And here's the question that I think lingers long after you close the books. If the word Afrikaner meant mixed-race person for 350 years and was only changed by a deliberate political campaign in 1876, if we were to hit undo on that change, what does South African culture look like today? Who are the real Afrikaners?
That is a question that completely rewrites the history books in your head. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. It's been a fascinating and really important journey.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you in the next one.